Hello everyone, MasterZeon1201 here, and in this video I'd like to commemorate the release of Boxcutter 717.3. In this version we are doing the true release of Boxcutter 717. The previous updates of 717 were to lead up to this moment of us actually getting everything in order that we actually intended to have for this release and actually provide a experience for the user that we feel is both feature complete and also capable of being utilized in a proper workflow in action. So without further ado, let's jump into this and begin going over some of the features that are new to this particular update, as well as a slight recap of some of the things that were added to updates previous. As always, an extensive release log has been done for this version, just letting users know what's new and what can be expected if you're a returning user, as well as just looking for what's new so you can just find something to jump in and play with quickly. So now let's get to it. So starting out, we'll talk about installation. So I will just rename my Blender folder to be Blender A, just put a big A at the end, and just rename all of it. And first we'll open 2.83.7, which is the current LTS version. We'll snap it into view and left search, next, and we're in. So from here we want to go into our preferences, and under add-ons we can just choose to install from file. We just want to go to C and our tools directory, and we'll install the latest version of Boxcutter _3. And after enabling it, we'll go ahead and install HardOps. Current version is _21. So we'll go ahead and install that from file and enable it as well. And after a brief hold, please hold, we now have it enabled. We want to turn off auto perspective. We also want to just jump through our interface settings here. I like to change my interface over to deep gray and also change my object selection appearance in the viewport. So in this case, we'll change our active object to something a little more tame, a little more tasty. And we'll also change our vertex size a little bit, face dot, outline width just a little bit thicker, just for me. And we'll raise our viewport samples, and everything else is pretty much good to go. I mean, we do also want to enable, say, loop tools. And we also want to enable curve tools. I do love curve tools. And under key map, we just want to go ahead and just search for cursor. And there's the place 3D cursor into 3D view where we see it shift right mouse button. We just want to change that to be geometry. It's just a thing I always do when it comes to configuring Blender. And under system, we can just make sure we're using the most of our computer. And then under save and load, we want to turn on auto run Python scripts, lower the auto save timer, and ensure that we're saving often, maybe even show up to 30 recent files. And from here we're basically good to go. In fact, I could point at my fonts, but we can just save our preferences, close it, and by pressing Shift H we now have our default scene, and we can just choose to save our startup scene like so. We can even jump into Boxcutter, go into HardOps under drop down, and we want to turn on Boxcutter notifications, and then from here we just save our startup scene. We could also press Q, go under the HardOps preferences, and just save our preferences through that. And now we're ready to begin. So if I just begin cutting, we see that everything is good to go. We can press D, go over to end gun. We can snap our view down, alt scroll over to Lasso, and just play with a little bit of Lasso. We can get in here and turn on adaptive, so that way we can zoom in and continue playing with Lasso, which is a fun way to just play with Lasso. And we see that Boxcutter is basically good to go. So with that, we'll just close this, and that is installing HardOps for 2.83. So the next one that we'll talk about is 2.91.0, which is the latest version. And this version of Blender is a little bit weird, but it is the one that I'm currently testing and spending all my time in because I just can't get enough of it, even though it's slightly off. And we'll just choose next, and we'll just choose to install these add-ons. So just going under install, we just want to go ahead and go to our tool location and install from file the latest version of Boxcutter. And we'll also install the latest version of HardOps _22 coming soon. And we'll just wait for it just a moment. Let's just clear the X, and it appears that our search query limited us from seeing it, but basically we now have HardOps installed, and we could also go through extra objects and enable those because I like to play with them. Curve tools I like. Loop tools is needed for circle, so we'll just enable those, and we could go through and just set everything up, but you definitely probably have an idea by now that basically we work with whatever version of Blender you throw at it, assuming that it's up to date with the recent API changes. Whenever things happen like that, it's beyond our control. But as you see, you are able to easily use Blender with the latest version of Blender 2.91.0 that hasn't came out, in addition to 2.90, which we haven't even talked about yet. So let's say I wanted to just shorthand my work for this. I'm actually going to copy this folder and then just paste it, and we're just going to make a copy. This is the laziest way to do things, but it'll pay off. So instead of going through that whole installation process, we're just going to rename this folder to be 2.90. And if we go to our stable releases and we open the actual current version of Blender, which is 2.90, we get Blender basically loaded with the same configuration preferences as the previous one. So we're in Boxcutter, we're ready to go, and everything's just set. So that's basically installation in a nutshell. If you have any issues, of course, let us know. But when it comes to installation, I always show it from vanilla setting just to show that there are no issues with installation when it comes to us. I always try to give it a thorough testing. So here you are seeing me use it with 2.90, 2.91.0, and 2.83.7. So all three versions are working. There's no need to ask us about, is it going to work with this version or does it work with the latest? We're always keeping vigilant to ensure that we always work with whatever version Blender currently has up on their site. So even the new Boolean stuff we are eager to take advantage of, but with that, we're now ready to begin. One of the first things you'll notice after getting Boxcutter installed is the return of fade. Typically we have our fade parameter set to the same thing as the FPS, which is 60. If we go ahead and expand the behavior panel and go to display, we can see that our fade is set to 60, which means that if I draw a cut, the fade happens so fast you can't really see anything. However, just letting you know that now it is back better than ever, so you can draw a shape, have a long fade time, and just watch it fade out ever so gracefully. Just a very nice way to enjoy Boxcutter. In fact, we'll go back in here, set it to 6,000, and just perform a couple of cuts. And we see that this cut will just take so long to fade out, yet we're still able to go in and draw subsequent shapes while we're waiting for previous shapes to finish fading away. So multi-shape support for fade has also been added to this update. So it's something that I'm very excited about. We were obsessed with performance enhancements with this latest update. So for that, we removed fade in order to ensure that performance was at least to the best of our possibilities, and then add fade back to see if fade was of any cause for us to experience slowdown, and this update just shows that it does not. So continuing on, also with fade there are sound effects. For example, if you set it to 1, 2, 3, you can bring about a sound effect that will do a nice little slapping sound or a crunch sound every time you perform a box cut. So this is a really interesting way to entertain your cat, but also something to just add a little bit of extra audible flair to Boxcutter whenever you're using it in action. So if you're new to Boxcutter and you just want to get in and begin playing with taper, it's as easy as drawing a shape and pressing Shift-T during the operation in order to adjust taper. There's multiple ways you can actually play with taper. You could draw a shape, right click, left click to pause, or press tab to pause. You could press Control D, and inside the mini helper for Boxcutter you can also adjust the taper amount here like so. You might notice that every time I cut, the taper is basically getting reset. So let's say I did perform a cut. So I'll just draw a cut and we'll press Shift-T and we cut and apply. And let's say we do another cut. We see that once again we have to press Shift-T in order to make this stay. Let's say that we actually wanted this to persist across operations. Well, that is where under behaviors there's a new option called persistent taper, and by enabling this it'll allow you to perform a taper, and then your next cut will also receive the exact same taper, so you can just taper repeatedly. The interesting thing about taper is that unlike all the rest of our modifiers, this one is able to be stacked up thanks to persistence with something like, say, bevel. And we can just draw a shape and we see that the bevel is here, the taper's here at the same time. We can go up here, we can enable something like solidification, and when we draw a shape, we're actually automatically solidifying it. On the way in, we could press T to adjust it, and we're just doing a tapered thickness cut, which can get a little bit strange in the 2D phase, as you can see here, but it's definitely available. One of the better ways to approach it would more than likely be to just draw as you would normally, and then during the extrusion, press T in order to adjust the thickness. And we'll be going into more depth on how we can adjust the workflow for that later. But in a nutshell, when you're drawing a shape, you can always just press Shift T in order to go in and adjust the amount of taper that's going on. You could also press Shift T to adjust it and press Shift R in order to reset it back to its neutral value. Here I am at something outlandish. We could press Shift R and it's been repeated to the initial taper amount. But you can always press Control D to bring up the mini helper, where you can just jump it back to the default amount of cut or play with additional taper presets that are available. Another thing about taper is, besides it having a hotkey on Shift T for you to adjust, taper also currently supports box. It supports circle, where you can press Shift T in order to adjust the taper on that as well. It also supports custom, which gives some rather interesting results. By pressing Shift T, it will begin tapering, which is one of my favorite things to do with the Boxcutter logo, just tapering it in, just seeing how it looks compared to the static look that we generally have whenever we cut things in linearly. So over my recent journeys of making normal maps, it made it apparent that our next journey needed to be getting the ability to taper objects, because whenever it comes to making a normal map, certain things read a lot better. If we were to just flatten our view over to a mat cap and look at this, we see that we're getting all sorts of delicious values here, while this is actually giving us very little. Shift is generally reserved for shifting shapes to live. For example, I can click and drag to create a box, and by shifting to live, I can now begin performing cuts on the cutter itself in order to cut back what was taken away by the cutter. And this is a pretty handy way to work. In fact, we'll select the main shape and we'll perform another cut, hold Shift in order to shift it to live, and that is Shift to live in a nutshell. In this update, we also seek to expand on the Shift functionality, because Shift has more potential to it than just being able to be held at the end of an operation. Let's say you wanted to actually use Shift in the middle of an operation. Well, now you can actually map Shift on the fly to be whatever operation you want it to be. So for example, by default, when we enable this, whenever we enable this, we see that the default operation is taper. And this means that whenever I draw my next shape after selecting it, if I hold Shift and move the mouse, you can see that I'm now able to Shift taper this on the fly while still being able to extrude and adjust it. And this can be a more interesting alternative way to work. Maybe you're not trying to actually extrude and taper every single time. Maybe you want to actually taper after you've performed the extrude. This just allows you to be a little bit more deliberative with your process and get more interesting results. But keep in mind that holding Shift at the end of the operation will allow you to shift it to live still. So depending on what operation you have mapped to this, it can get a little bit sticky and problematic. However, this is something that we are working on internally. So I will, instead of taper, change it to solidify. And now I'm able to draw a shape, perform an extrude, and then hold Shift at any time in order to jump in and begin solidifying this shape. So I feel that this offers a much more versatile way to work with Boxcutter, depending on your style and mode of working, depending on what step you're on. Maybe you're on the step where you're just adding cuts and detailing like you see me doing here, and you just want to perform cuts on the fly, but you occasionally want to just hold Shift, jump over to solidify, and just perform a quick solidification. Another one is, let's say that we had bevel in, and you selected bevel. Well, now you can just draw a shape, hold Shift at any time, and just immediately begin beveling. Just draw unbeveled boxes on the fly whenever you need to, but at that time where it is essential, you can just hold Shift, bring it in, and just draw the bevel just as you need. Another one that I'm actually a fan of is going here and changing it to move. So you can just draw a shape, how you need, and just hold shift and just move it around where you need, and then just place it and continue on working. A little bit faster sometimes than just pressing G. Shift is one of the biggest buttons on the keyboard, so just locking it down for just the state of keeping shapes live seemed like a bit of a waste for this key. So just letting you know that a very expansive shift system has been created that now is supporting all the items listed here, and even has a preset system where you can choose which operations will support when shift is allowed to be used as a modifier to trigger these in action. So it's something definitely worth experimenting with, but a lot of work has been put into it, and I'm eager to show you guys what we have planned for it going forward over the course of implementing it all throughout our tools. You know, fun fact, there was once a time where if we were to take the shape and move it up one Blender unit, view alignment would no longer work. And I always thought that was kind of funny. I mean, it wasn't very funny because that was a pretty serious bug that was able to be exploited very easily. But I am glad for the most part that we're no longer living in that age where wherever your object is, you're having issues cutting it. You can actually have it just placed anywhere and be able to just work with it. However, things were not always so peachy. And, you know, another issue that came about was orientation. So everything's fine right now, right? I'm able to cut this box. Everything's good. Everything's oriented just fine. And I'm able to cut it pretty much the way I would want if I were, you know, dictating which angle and edge to orient to in order to make this cut. However, let's say that we were to undo all of these cuts and we just go into edit mode and we rotate it. Just a simple rotation in edit mode, meaning that we can't press Alt-R to reset it. That means that whenever I draw a cut, it's not going to be aligned right. And if I draw another cut, that one's not going to be aligned right. In fact, I'll try to draw a cut here. We see that because I started off with this face, it was able to play off of it. But this cut that we first drew inherently is incorrect, and so is this cut. This cut is also terribly incorrect, and this is just insufficient. And it was always kind of funny to me that this sort of issue existed. It's one of the things on to-do lists that I've always wanted to get resolved, and so I'm eager to say in this particular version of Boxcutter, under alignment options, there's now additional orient methods that can be used. For example, we'll change this to nearest edge, and you see that I'm able to draw this cut easy breezy and everything just works. And that's one of the benefits to this particular update, is that there's now additional orientation options, and I recommend getting acquainted with them and finding which options work best for you depending on your situation. Even though box is a rather simple shape, there's a lot to it that I feel that could be expanded upon as far as getting it to be just a perfect cutter. And one of those things to me has always been the ability to get it oriented correctly on the fly to make a cut no matter what the situation is. In fact, right here we see that we reached the bounds of our current solution with this, and so, you know, 2 solutions would have done the job. However, for this reason there is 3, and this is where we can then switch over to longest edge, and we're able to continue cutting, and we have that accuracy happening, at least as far as calculations go, with calculating it with the surface that's being vectored to whenever you're drawing. So just letting you know that this has been improved in Boxcutter 717.3. Alt scroll has been improved this update, allowing you to alt scroll on the fly whenever you need to get to the shape you want. And we'll just jump over to Lasso. Lasso was added just as a freehand solution for users to draw shapes as they want on the fly. However, in this newest update, we also added the ability for adaptive lasso, but before showing it, I'll just show some of the limitations of general lasso. So here we are, zooming in, we're able to draw a cut. We zoom in a little bit more, and you can now see the faceting beginning to happen on the edges. So if we zoom in a little bit more, we see that drawing a lasso begins to get just a little bit harder because of the distance parameter needing to be adjusted. So having users actually go up to the top and adjust this on the fly to get it lower and lower as they're zoomed in on a model was something that I found to be a little bit inadequate. So in this update, we've added an option for adaptive. And so if we just Control Z undo these, which we actually were able to get a little far, we'll just turn on adaptive, and now we can see that we're able to draw and zoom in and basically work at any zoom level when it comes to using the lasso. And so this is a dramatic improvement when it comes to, you know, freehand detailing on the surfaces. I'm kind of butchering it here, but you get the point. So let's draw that again, and we see that this is actually almost too small for us to draw. And if we zoom out, we can see actually the scale in which we were trying to work there. So Adaptive Lasso has been expanded to support multiple zoom levels, contrary to before. So in closing, I want to say if you're one of these users who are experimenting with the current version of 2.91, just know that it is definitely a fun time and a half, but there are also additional bugs that we're still waiting to be resolved in order to truly begin to progress in it. So right now I'm using 2.90.1, so if I were to press Alt W, start Boxcutter and draw a box, and shift to live, we can select the main shape and look at its boolean. You can see there's only 3 icons for this. And if we tap into edit mode, we see that we're on the unmodified version of the shape, which is how you should probably be used to Boxcutter if you're using it in edit mode in a version less than 2.91. So just to kind of show that in action, so in edit mode we can also draw, cut, shift it to live, and we are able to modify this in object mode. And it's the same classic behavior that you know and love. We can even select this shape, choose to apply it specifically, jumping us back into edit mode of the original shape that we were dealing with previously. And that's good and all. But just keep in mind that if your version of Blender only shows 2 icons for the boolean, that you are in 2.90. So if we were to minimize this, we are now in 2.91, where if we expand our modifier panel, you can see that if we draw a box, there's an additional option here that actually will display the modifier in edit mode. And what this means is that if you tab into edit mode, you can actually Alt W, jump into Boxcutter, and see your cuts happening in real time, as if they were fully destructive, but everything is completely non-destructive. And this is actually really interesting and something that we look forward to expanding on in the future as Blender makes this the the main way that Blender is. But just something of an interesting observation I wanted to point out, and was kind of the basis behind the orientation system improvements that came with this update. And like I was saying, because this is all non-destructive, we can shift scroll through the modifier scroll, and you can see that my icons are black, which means that I'm currently in 2.91, and also the colors are just slightly off, but I'm the only one I guess who can tell. But as you can see, everything is still non-destructive, versus if we go back to 2.90, everything that I was doing in edit mode was destructive unless I held shift. So just one of those interesting things you may want to try out if you're experimenting with the Blender version manager like myself. But just letting you know that there is support for 2.83, 2.90.1, and also 2.91.0.